Hi, Grandma here, and we are reading It's a Jungle Out There. And chapter 10 is called Yellow Brother, Yellow Mother. And then we have a picture of two men in a boat, or a canoe of some kind. Sharankama wasn't a particularly good role model. He was a fierce, rugged man with a tiger tooth carved to fit into his top gum, where one of his own teeth had rotted out. He was bald, rare among the Machis, so he always wore a tattered cap to avoid being called Gourdhead. His face looked like an unfinished mahogany wood carving, still waiting for the final touches to make it handsome. And I think that's who is sitting right here in the boat, is this man that they're talking about. Sharankama had a lot more power than most Machis, but he had gotten it by capturing his fellow Mashagingas and turning them over to rubber companies as slaves. When other influential Mashagingas got in his way, he used his authority, meaning his gun he got from the rubber companies, to kill them. To put it bluntly, he was a murderer, thief, and slave trader. I thought he was really cool. When we first met powerful Sharankama, we were living in our very first house in Picha, and he was lying powerless in the bottom of a canoe, dying of diarrhea. The slaves who brought him to us had poled and paddled his canoe all the way up from the Picha River, a full week's trip, hoping that Dad and Mom could give him some medicine. They did, and Sharankama became a grateful friend, calling my parents father and mother for the rest of his life. He was a dutiful son to them, a special brother to me. Every year after they saved his life, he made the long trip to visit us whenever we happened to be living at the time, bringing gifts and trade goods. The second time Sharankama visited us, we were living in Picha, and he had just heard about the school that had started there. Although he already had a lot of power around Picha because of his ruthless reputation, he'd been told that if he learned to read and write, he would be able to sit at a desk and tell people what to do. That was too good to pass up. So he asked Dad if he could get a school started at Picha like the one at Picha. Dad started with the basics. How many students do you have? My family and slaves. Before you can have a school, you have to have at least 20 students. Go get some people together, and then we'll send a teacher. Traditionally, the Mashagingas lived in small, isolated family groups rather than in villages. Nani, Sharankama agreed. Then, before he left to return to Picha, he tried to show his gratitude. Here, you can have Olivia. All I want is a machete for her. 13-year-old Olivia trembled at the thought of being Sharankama's way of saying thanks to Dad, but she didn't have much choice. Sharankama barked out orders telling her what he expected of her as the gringo's slave. Fortunately, Dad didn't need another slave since he already had Mom and Terry and me. We don't want her. Hopefully Olivia didn't take it personally. Keep her anyway. Okay, she can stay and help us, but we'll pay for help, and we'll send her back to you later. Sharankama returned downriver to Picha, assured that if he got enough students together, he would get a school. The next year when he returned, we in the school were moving to Etariato. In fact, it was Sharankama and his slaves who did us that favor, that should be in quote marks, of dumping all our belongings off the raft into the Pongo between Pangoa and Etariato when we moved. I have about 20 students ready for school at Picha, Sharankama reported. Can you give us a teacher now? No one asked how he'd gotten so many people to move together so quickly. Many of the children, it turned out, were orphans. True to his word, Dad asked Abelino to be the first teacher at Picha, but he didn't last long. He developed tuberculosis and was too much of a tightwad to spend any of his precious teacher's pay on the expensive medicine. Still, he earned the people's respect by sticking with them in the school until his last breath. After Abellino died, Mario replaced him at the Picho school. It was Mario's first teaching position, but in his crazy way, he soon had all of the school kids in the palm of his hand. In fact, about 20 of them lived in his own home, the Picha version of a children's home. He was about 15, with a squashed flat nose, tattoos on his face, wildly bowed legs, and a total height of about 4'10". He looked like a miniature brown cowboy that had just been thrown face first into the side of a barn. He was always full of adventure, energy, and ideas. In Timpia and at Riato, he used to play with us in the river. No matter how hard we tried, we never could drown him. Mario was an independent and feisty as any machi ever was. And even as a teenager, he would stand up to Shirankama. As a matter of fact, he later stole one of Shirankama's slave girls for a wife. Rather than shoot him, Shirankama asked my dad to intervene. After 7 hours of talking back and forth, Mario still had his wife. He was one of my heroes, and I loved him like a big brother. Through the next few years, Dad and Mom both visited Picha briefly, but we had never lived there as a family. Shirankama repeatedly begged us to come, wanting advice on the school, medical help for the people, teaching from the scripture portions that my parents had translated so far. Finally, it looked as if we were going to get to spend a few months at Picha. When school got out in 1959, we flew right out to Kimasaya, planning to spend a few weeks there before we moved to Picha. On June 29th, the day Terry turned 9, he turned yellow. Since yellow wasn't his normal color, his complexion worried Dad and Mom, even though it was kind of fun for us to stare at yellow eyeballs, yellow skin, dark brown yellow urine, he said. He was so tired he didn't even want to get out of bed to celebrate. Teramoto, wake up, son! Happy birthday! Dad wanted him to join us for breakfast, which Terry wasn't enthusiastic about. After breakfast, Dad and Mom gave him a whopping $2 and 9 balloons and his own box of fudge. He felt so awful, I wondered if maybe I'd get the fudge, but I couldn't say anything just yet. After a long day of lying around doing nothing, Terry didn't even eat his special birthday supper of smoked fish and boiled manioc. For dessert, we had chocolate cake baked in a frying pan over hot coals. Mom lit it up with candles, and we all tried to celebrate. In the yellow candlelight, Terry looked even yellower. Since he didn't want any cake, it was time to assume something was drastically wrong. The next day, Terry was genuinely sick. There was a worm making its painful home in my right foot, and Mom was taking sulfa tablets to fight off some diarrhea. To top it off, all our stuff was a mess as we sorted and packed for our move to Picha. It seemed sometimes as if our whole lives were in a mess. Thursday morning, when the plane, already on its way to take us to Picha, Dad decided it was time to consult the doctor at Yaranakacha. Yarina, this is Kamasaya. Do you copy us? Over. Roger, Kamasaya, you're coming in nicely. What can we do for you? Over. Well, we've got a sick boy on our hands and need to talk to Doc. Can you set us up with a sked? Over. Wayne, stand by a minute while I try to reach him. Roger, we're standing by. We waited while the radio operator tried to reach Doc. Kamasaya, he finally replied. We can't get a hold of Doc. Corny Hibbert just had her baby and he's at the clinic with her. Do you want me to keep trying? Over. No, Dad answered with a hint of frustration. We're expecting the plane any time and we've got to get our radio down. We'll check back when we get our antenna up in Picha. Thanks anyway. Over and out. Uncle George Ensley landed the little Aeronca float plane in front of our house around 2 o'clock, and helped cram Mom, Sandy, and Melody in with a load of baggage for the first 20-minute flight. Things weren't any better in Picha. When Mom and the girls landed, all of the men were gone except for a couple of frightened longhairs, the most primitive of the Machiginga. They weren't about to get close to the plane, so Mom and Uncle George unloaded it themselves. Then, while Mom and the girls started cleaning out the house and hanging mosquito nets, Uncle George came back for us. While the plane was making the trip, Terry just lay on the porch in a yellow haze, and I hobbled around on one foot. When it finally came back to us, we painfully helped Dad and Uncle George cram in another load of baggage and ourselves on top of it. Our ears popped as we lopsidedly broke free of the water on the first try. "Hey, we did it!" Uncle George yelled with a big smile, patting the instrument panel affectionately. At least that's probably what he yelled. It was a little hard to tell over the noise of the engine. Talking to each other in an air knocker was like a conversation between two people who were hard of hearing. I know what that's like. It involved a lot of yelling, a lot of saying "uh-huh" to questions you really couldn't hear, and lip reading. Unfortunately, when you're sitting behind the pilot, it's hard to read lips. "How's everybody doing back there?" "Uh-huh," Terry and I said. "Are you comfortable?" "Oh, about 2 months, if possible," Dad answered. "Old Terry's not feeling so good, huh?" "Oh, we've got some sandwiches. We'll be all right." And so it went. A cool, refreshing wind blasted in the vent holes, and we relaxed as we wound our way between fluffy white clouds. When the floats first hit the water, they danced along like a skipping stone until the pilot cut the engine and we settled down on the water to taxi ashore. Within 15 minutes, an unbelievable assortment of stuff appeared out of the little airplane like rabbits out of a magician's hat. Several Machiginga men arrived back from a canoe trip downriver just as we were unloading, and they were thrilled to get in on part of this magnificent show. "Pakakebi," the typical Machiginga greeting, seemed a rather obvious question. "You've come?" Out of courtesy, every Kushma-clad resident had to ask everyone who just arrived, presumably to ensure that everyone who seemed to be standing there really was. "I've come," I answered dozens of times. In between swatting gnats and responding to greetings and limping in the sand, I helped get the radio set up on the beach so Dad could call Yarina again. "Yarina, this is Ron Snell, and we've all just arrived at Picha. What are chances of getting a hold of Doc now? Over." "Oh, Roger, Picha, we'll get him. Stand by." In a few moments, Uncle Doc's raspy voice asked some diagnostic questions and told Dad how to feel Terry's liver for possible enlargement. It didn't take long to come up with the verdict. "Sounds to me like hepatitis. I think George should spend the night out there and bring Terry in with him tomorrow. There's not much you can do for him, and he can stay with us until he's over it." Doc hadn't even bothered to ask Aunt Beth, his wife, if that was all right. He just assumed that she wouldn't mind a third boy in the house, even a yellow one. We kids liked Yaranakacha, and Phil and Mark Enkelberger were just like brothers. But living in the tribe for the summer was our piece of paradise. To have to go back to Yarina just when he'd got out there was about like getting 3 months of detention for Terry. Even a promise that he could take his puppy with him wasn't much of a consolation. Sadly, we headed for the house the Indians had cleaned for us. In their enthusiasm to have us there, the small community had gone to great lengths to make sure that once we arrived, we would be able to actually get to our house. They had graciously cut dozens of steps into the clay so Mom could go back and forth to the river, carrying nothing more than herself and even so clutching a helpful brown arm for support. Since teacher Mario had lived near us in both Timpia and Etirato years before, he still had vivid memories of watching Don Juan haul Mom bodily up the bank. He was the one who had suggested the steps. Helpful men hoisted boxes, bags, and sacks to their shoulders and carried them up for us. The house we headed for had the usual Pona floor, 2 feet off the ground, and a thatched roof made of thousands of special palm leaves, neatly folded and interlaced. About 100 crickets and a family of bats lived in our roof. There were no walls. 6 thick logs buried deep in the ground held up the floor and roof. Of course, the whole house was tied together with vines. A notched log got us from the ground to the floor. Within minutes, the whole place was chaotic confusion. Our supplies were scattered all over the floor. Curious Indians by the dozens crowded around just to watch, since admission was free. Thursday afternoon at the matinee. By the time it was dark, we were ready for the night. Air mattresses were inflated, mosquito nets up, drinking water boiled on our log fire. Crackers and a can of tuna fish would hold us over until we could get organized. Dessert was 1 malted milk ball apiece, a special treat a friend in Yaranakacha had sent on the plane. We went to bed, all on the floor, all in a row. The next morning, we got up early to get Terry and Uncle George off on the knocker. Over the radio, Uncle Doc assured us they were ready and waiting. It wasn't a happy morning for any of us, winding single file down to the plane like part of a funeral procession. It didn't take any time at all to load Terry, the dog, and his little bag of stuff, and then we all waved goodbye as the Arianka, that's the airplane, taxied out into the river and lifted off. Yellow tears ran down Terry's yellow face as he looked out the window of the yellow plane. The next couple of days were full. When I wasn't playing, I worked with my parents, tying together shelves, sorting boxes and cans, setting up a rough counter for the Primus stove, and keeping our cook fire going. Neighbors came with woven mats to tie around part of the house so the wind wouldn't blow everything off our porch. By Sunday, things were finally taking shape. After church in the schoolhouse, I took 5-year-old Sandy and 3-year-old Melody down to the river to swim with Mario's pet tapir, while Dad and Mom went for a walk in the jungle. I'm sure what Mom really wanted to do was eat malted milk balls without having to share. On the walk, Mom started feeling weird. She and Dad were looking at purple passion flowers that grew around the village. Her malted milk balls weren't going down too well, which for Mom is a little like going to paradise and suddenly coming to the conclusion that you can't stand it. By Monday, she had aching joints and a high fever that aspirin couldn't bring down. Tuesday was worse, but she struggled along, trying to bring a little order into the remaining mess around us. An epidemic of flu had just hit the tribal area, and everyone assumed that's what it was. Dark, drippy Wednesday was an ominous day. Mom was sick to her stomach, irritable and increasingly depressed, lying for long stretches on her floor mat. It rained all day. Our whole world was socked in and soaked with clouds, drizzle, and blowing mist. The only way to get anywhere was to wade through puddles and along muddy trails. The roof over the flimsy outhouse leaked, soaking the toilet paper and making our already squatting boards pretty risky. Our little enamel potty was getting a lot of good use. That's probably the one they used in the house. Night came early under the black clouds, and we went to bed by 8 o'clock, as usual, laid out side by side on the floor along one wall, with me closest to the front of the house. Rain drip, drip, dripped off the roof. Under most circumstances, it was a sound we loved, a cozy sound that put us right to sleep, curled up under our blankets. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. We were all used to being sick, but Mom looked really bad, and we were a long way from help. A plane would never be able to come after us if the blowing rain kept up. Our stuff was still mostly in boxes, and food was hard to fix. The only difference between this and camping out was fun. Tossing and turning in my white mosquito net, I could hear our neighbors quietly muttering to each other, clearing their throats to spit or getting up to go to the bushes. They didn't have enamel potties. Their palm floors, like ours, creaked and bounced as they walked. Dogs barked and growled, babies cried, crickets chirped on the roof. The smell of dying cook fires drifted through the house. Fruit bats fluttered in the rafters. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the familiar sounds of home. Suddenly, there was a loud, splintering crack, followed by a heavy crash, as if a tree had just fallen in on our house. This wasn't one of the familiar sounds of home. Flashlights clicked on. Groggy eyes tried to focus. "Daddy," Sandy said drowsily, "the roof just fell down." Then she went back to sleep, as if it happened all the time. Dad and I took a closer look. She was right. The day's rain had soaked into the thatch, weighing it down. The right front house pole, already old and tired, split under the heavy load. The whole front corner of our roof sat on our porch in a clutter of torn palm leaves. It seemed an awful time to have our roof fall in, with Mom sick and all. "What if the rest of it falls down?" I asked. We were, after all, sleeping under it. "Oh, I think it'll be all right. Let's go back to bed." There wasn't anything we could do about it anyway. Thursday morning, our house went from bad to awful. Our still scattered stuff was covered with bits of leaves. The Indians came to begin repairs, taking apart broken sections and hauling in new logs, vines, and leaves. Dad started the generator that powered our huge radio and yelled into it as he talked to Yaranacacha. Reception was poor, but it wouldn't have mattered if it had been excellent. Dad just yelled into the radios as if he didn't really trust wireless connections. In the midst of it all, Mom lay in the back of the noisy, bouncing, cluttering, shaking house, rapidly getting worse and worse. Dad asked to talk to Dr. Eichenberger, and luckily got right through. "Doc, we're thinking Betty might have hepatitis too. She's not yellow yet, but she's pretty nauseated and has a high fever, and her right side is quite tender. Any chance you could come out on the plane and look her over?" Uncle Doc shook his head invisibly over the radio. "If she's crackle, sputter, crackle sick, you better just, right away. She's going to need some crackle pop for a while. How copy so far?" "Loud and clear," Dad shouted. Anything intelligible was considered loud and clear, and we were all experts at filling in the blanks. "We'll get her there as soon as we can." "I'll get things cracked this end." Uncle Doc had had hepatitis himself a few years before and knew just what to expect emotionally and physically, except he didn't know that Mom would be much worse than he expected. Numbly, we all scurried to pack up the things we had just unpacked, worried through the night, roofless. Disappointment hung over the whole village. We had just come and we were already leaving. It was a confusing and exhausting day. Since the Catalina flying boat was going to be in the area with visitors anyway, passengers were juggled and shuttled back and forth between villages. Mom was stuck in Picha most of the day without food, water, or radio. By the time the Aranca finally came to get her in the afternoon, she had given up hope and was deliriously imagining she had been abandoned to die in the village. She barely made it to the plane and almost couldn't get in. Worse yet was the transfer from the Aranca across the beach and up into the Catalina's high bubble door. I don't think I can make it, she whispered as she looked up the wobbly aluminum ladder. Strong pilot's arms reached down to pull her up, and one pilot got his head under her and pushed her backside. She toppled into the hull and collapsed on an aluminum bench. Someone handed her a cup of chicken broth. She was getting yellow fast. The rest of us climbed in, and we bounced off the rocks to settle into the churning river. Our return to Yaranacacha was a long 2 hours in the Catalina, and it was late in the afternoon by the time we finally touched down on the lake. When we first hit the water, it sounded like gravel spraying against the aluminum hull. Flying water completely covered the bubble windows and dripped in through cracks as we slowed down. We taxied to a long concrete ramp and roared up it, both engines at full power, to park beside the hangar. The bouncy Burma Jeep got Mom to a room in the Eichenberger's house. Uncle Doc had figured she'd just be there for a couple hours while we cleaned out our house and made the beds. When he actually saw how quickly she was deteriorating, he immediately asked a pilot to fly him to Pucallpa for some IV supplies. He got back as the sun set, started the IV, and stood by. Along the way, in bits and pieces, we heard the bad news. Hepatitis is a virus that attacks your liver. When your liver quits working, Uncle Doc explained, poisons stay in your body, and they're what make you so sick and so yellow. They also make you feel dependent and desperate. Your mom isn't going to want people around, and she'll get upset about all kinds of things. For a long time, she'll feel like all she wants to do is die. Is she going to die? The unanswerable question on 4 kids' minds. Will there be permanent damage to her liver? We knew of missionaries who never really recovered from hepatitis and had to leave the field. We'll just have to wait and pray and see, Dad answered. Uncle Doc wasn't God. In church on Sunday morning, Uncle Doc urged everyone to pray. He had never seen anyone live through a case as severe as this one, and the only treatment was rest and a strict diet that prohibited, among other things, greasy foods. It was the end of July before Dad could relax enough to reassure my grandparents in the U.S. Terry had made a full recovery. I had mostly recovered from a very mild case, and Mom was slowly improving. She could sit up for 15 minutes a day and eat real food, even though she still had nurses watching her 24 hours a day. Mom spent 2 months pretty much flat in bed, first at the Eichenbergers and then at the clinic. I remember the first time we all got to go visit her at the clinic. Dad, who had a hard time expressing his emotions, said in a kind of husky voice, "You know, I was really afraid we were going to lose your mommy girl." Without God's help, we would have, so we paused to thank him for caring. After nearly a year of limited activity, Mom made a complete recovery, except that ever since the hepatitis, she's had severe physiologically induced panic attacks whenever she flies. Given our lifestyle, that's been a high price to pay. Well, that took me back a couple of years when I had hepatitis. I don't know if my grandchildren remember when I was sick about, I think 5 years ago. And I was also yellow, and my eyes were yellow. Anyway, getting back to the book, the next chapter is 11, and it's called Bats and Rats and Status Symbols, but the picture is what really amuses me. They look like just regular kids, don't they? Not kids growing up in a jungle with missionary parents. Okay, bye-bye.